Hello and welcome to another poetry analysis. This time I'll be going through the poem The Emigrée by Rumens, again from the Power and Conflict Anthology for the GCSE English Literature EQA exam board. So, as always, I'll start off with a reading of the poem, and then some context of the poet, and then an in-depth analysis. So first, a reading. The Emigrée. There once was a country. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November which, I am told, comes to the mildest city. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright-filled paperweight. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes, glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks, and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. That child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every colored molecule of it. It may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. I have no passport. There's no way back at all, but my city comes to me in its own white plane. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. My city hides behind me. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. So now some context of the poet Carol Rumens. She was born in 1944 and lived in both Belfast and Wales. She also traveled around in Russia and many countries in Eastern Europe, from which she may have come across the idea of writing this poem. The Emigrée is in a collection of poems published in 1993 called Thinking of Skins. Before moving on to the analysis, the title of the poem, The Emigrée, is actually from the French émigré in its female form, as someone who has left their country to permanently reside in a different country. Before going into my analysis, I just want to show you this sheet which I've used for all of my poems. This sheet was provided by my head of English, the blank grid, and splits a poem into 6 distinct categories of themes, language, structure, context, connections, and interpretations. So this makes it a lot easier to revise a poem after or before an exam. So now the analysis. I'll begin with the themes. So the first key theme of this poem is a loss of identity. So in the third stanza, I have no passport. The narrator no longer has a form of identity linking them back to their country. Next, we have the theme of the power of the city in the narrator's mind. So, for example, in the first stanza, my memory of it is sunlight clear. The fact that the memory is sunlight clear instead of just clear is a compound adjective that shows that the city has been very powerful and has imprinted itself upon the narrator. Thirdly, the poem has a theme of being exiled, so again shown through I have no passport and they accuse me of darkness. This exile can be linked to other poems, as I'll go on to mention. Now moving on to language, We begin with the imagery of sunlight, which is throughout the entire poem. So being sunlight clear, branded by an impression of sunlight. It tastes of sunlight. My shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. Every stanza ends with sunlight, and this emphasizes the fact that the memory the narrator holds of their city is so pure and innocent and positive that they can't get rid of the impression of sunlight that they have. Next, we have the juxtaposition, which is a contrast of two ideas placed near each other. In the final line, my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. The fact that the shadow is mentioned perhaps creates a dark tone in contrast with the sunlight and the positive imagery. Next, we have the metaphor in the second stanza as time rules its tanks. Now, the tanks is an allusion, it references to war, which may have been what caused the emigration, and the fact that time rules its tanks may suggest that the narrator's memories of the city are being eroded over time. Next, we have the metaphor and personification of her city being sick with tyrants. Again, this reference to negative imagery and also perhaps to war of a civil war against a dictator. Again, shows how she's had to leave the city due to negative experiences as a child, but is still branded with an impression of sunlight. There is a very stark contrast between dark and negative imagery compared to positive imagery, as I've mentioned, through tyrants and dark and death against the positive imagery of sunlight, graceful slopes, and the white plain. Now, this contrast may show the internal conflict of the country throughout the poem, and it can also perhaps suggest that despite the darkness, despite the dark side of the country, there's always a silver lining to the cloud. There's always a positive image to contrast with it. Next, we have a personification of the city, particularly in the final stanza. My city comes to me, my city lies down, it takes me dancing, as docile as paper. All of this personification of her city again shows the narrator's heavy impression of the city in a positive light, being docile and taking her dancing. It creates the impression that the narrator had an intimate relationship with the city. Next, we have symbolism of my city hides behind me. This links with the theme of losing identity. Her city is now hiding, or at least the original city, while they accuse her. The ambiguous they and contrasting with her city hiding, so it perhaps shows that over time her city has changed due to the war and tyrants. There is ambiguity and ambiguous language used throughout the poem. For example, in the first stanza, we have her saying that I never saw it or I am told, and in the final stanza, they accuse me. Now, all of this ambiguous imagery and also the fact that she never mentions the name of a city or the country may be an attempt by Rumens to create a poem which is relatable to all people, relatable to all of their childhoods, their memories, no longer able to experience them again, but they will always glow. And finally, for language, there is the metaphor in the first stanza of her city being like a bright-filled paperweight. The fact that it's both bright and full suggests the positive memories that she has of it, and because it's full, she holds many memories of it. And the fact that it is described as a paperweight can show that the memories have a use to her. Perhaps as she collects every colored molecule, another metaphor, she wishes to remember everything about her city. Now, structure. The poem has a very regular stanza length, being the first and second stanza being 8 lines and the final stanza being 9 lines. The final stanza being 9 lines may be because the narrator wishes to prolong her final memories of the city. Throughout the poem, we see examples of enjambment, which is where a line runs onto the next, where a sentence or clause goes onto the next line, which creates a form of flowing effect, and also creates a form of it creates a tone as if someone is telling the story to you. So, for example, we have graceful slopes, then the next line, glow. The fact that it goes onto the next line makes it seem as if the memories of the city are never ending. We also have caesure throughout the poem, where there's a piece of punctuation in the middle of the line, which creates a short pause, which causes the reader to stop and to think about what has just happened. So, for example, my city takes me dancing through the city, next line of walls, and then we have a caesura, so this is an example of both the enjambment and the caesure, and then it goes on to they accuse me. So this caesura in particular marks a shift of tone, going from the positive memory of her city going dancing to they accuse me of her being isolated and perhaps linking with the theme of being exiled. The entire poem is written in free verse, as in there is no regular structure to the syllables and the lines. This further adds to the story-like tone of the poem and how the memories are continuous and they don't have a particular end. Next, as mentioned before, there is a refrain of the mention of imagery of sunlight. A refrain is where at the end of each stanza or at the end of each section there is a recurring image, so in this case of sunlight. The repetition of the imagery of sunlight emphasizes how no matter what negative experiences that she is told about of the city, there is always the sunlight at the end. Furthermore, the poem is in the first person, so use of personal pronouns like my city and my shadow, and also I. The fact that it's a personal experience creates the effect as if the poem can be related to anyone, and it makes the poem feel more vivid to any reader or any audience. In addition, the poem begins in a story-like tone, There Once Was a Country, which is reminiscent of a childhood story, which may link to how she had to leave her country as a child, and her memories of it are still childlike. She has to begin with the childlike, There Once Was a Country. Now, moving on to context. As I said before, Rumens traveled around Russia and Europe, and she was fascinated by other people's stories, by elsewhere. So this poem could be an extension of her enjoyment in other people's stories in other cultures. And as seen through a lot of her poetry, there are references to other cultures and other societies as it is in this poem. Um, this poem intentionally does not reference to a specific city or country, which makes the poem a lot more relatable to any reader or audience who may have experienced a similar scenario in which they had to leave their country due to war or due to a tyrant ruling it. Next, we have the connections, how this poem can be compared with others in an exam-like condition. So, firstly, this poem can be compared to Kamikaze, as the narrator in this poem and the pilot in Kamikaze were both exiled, were both outcasts from society. So in Kamikaze, we have in one of the final stanzas, he was treated as though he never existed, whereas in this poem, in the final stanza, we have they accuse me of being dark in their city. So both of the narrators have been outcast by society. Next, this poem can be compared with poppies, because in both poems the narrators experience a loss due to conflict. So in Poppies, the narrator traces the inscription on the war memorial because her son went to war, and it may be that he died and his name has been carved into the memorial. And in this poem, in the first stanza, we have the fact that the country may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. So this similarity between them uh, can be used to can be compared with each other in an exam scenario. Finally, interpretations. I feel that the main point of this poem is to show the power of the city or the power of memories to the narrator. And this is shown through the refrain and repetition of the positive imagery of sunlight. No matter what negative experience is described in the stanzas, if it's tyrants or if the narrator is being exiled, isolated, and accused, it always ends with a positive imagery of sunlight. Now that I've gone through an analysis, I would just like to remind you that in an exam, you always have to mention the effect of a quote. For example, the repetition of the refrain of sunlight uh, has an effect on the reader. By ending with the word sunlight, it leaves the reader with a positive influence, with a positive image of the city that had been described by the poem. Furthermore, another effect of the poem could be shown through the second stanza as time rolls its tanks. Time is shown to be the ultimate power of nature, that no matter what memories you build up, the time will roll its tanks as it is in the poem and will eventually erode away the memories. However, this poem ends the stanza with sunlight, as always, and replaces the negative with a positive, and again it leaves the reader with a positive image of the memories that no matter what, the city to the narrator will always remain in a good light. It will always be positive to the narrator. This has been an analysis of the Emigrée by Hasan Adil. Please keep in mind that this is my analysis and there may be images which you feel have a bigger influence and can be analyzed in greater depth. So please feel free to do so in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other poetry analysis videos, and I'll see you later. Thank you for watching.